about time for our class to begin. We're glad to have each and every one of you here for this Wednesday evening. Hope you've had a good Wednesday. Hope your day's been good and that we're ready to look at some things from the Old Testament. One of the blessings of studying the Old Testament and going by verse to verse, but what you get out of that is a lot of biblical principles that are applied in the New Testament, not under a system of law as we see in the Old Testament, but in the gospel dispensation, there's still these principles of a God who doesn't change. And if we get our mindset as we look at these statements about God and about certain terminology that we see, for example, the great day of Jehovah, the day of the Lord. The day of Jehovah, is that a day of, I just can't wait for the day of Jehovah? It's a sobering thought. It's the day of what? Well, let's read verse 15 of chapter 1. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness, desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day in the trumpet and alarm against the fortified cities, against the high battlements. We're safe, high battlements, there's alarm, but that's not a very peaceful moment, the day of Jehovah. We don't have to fear day of Jehovah, but it's a day of judgment, the day of the Lord, when he will be exalted above all. All men will be judged. Not that they had not determined their eternity while living upon earth, is that they're standing before the Lord to bow their knees as he cast them away into hell, or they go into heaven. But that's the point that you say, well, the day of the Lord's coming in the New Testament. And it is always a day of judgment, a day of wrath and destruction upon all of the ungodly men. So we talked about that last week. So let's get into question number 10. Why is God about to bring distress upon his people? That's the thought of that we see. It's going ready to occur. That's going to be upon his people. And why is that?
Verse 17 says they sin.
They sin. That's a kind of a principle, isn't it? Sin is always going to bring judgment of God. He's a holy God, and violating the law, we sin, transgressing God's law. But notice how he describes this. I will bring distress upon men, and they shall walk like blind men, because they've sinned against Jehovah. And he says, and their blood shall be poured out as dust, and their flesh as nothing. Neither are they going to be able to have the gold and silver to buy them out of this. This is what's going to bring judgment upon God's people. And broadly for all mankind, and he's getting ready to speak about the nations. But there's the case where they've sinned against Jehovah. But what do you get by the terminology, their blood shall be poured out as dust, and their flesh as dung? I got that, mankind, flesh and blood, blood and flesh. So he speaks about those parts that make up mankind, that characterize them, but as dung, your flesh is dung, blood is the dust. That's God speaking. You ever thought about what God thinks about things? And he said, well, you're not very, very nice to mankind. They don't even, because that's kind of like it's worth nothing. There's nothing of value. And our precious lifeblood, our flesh, it is as if it were nothing as God brings them into judgment. Their wealth is not going to provide for them. And it's in that context that indeed it's like what you thought yourself as being something special, flesh and blood, and here we are. We're God's people. If we're looking at Jerusalem, and that judgment is going to come upon God's people, we see that here's the days of Josiah. We think, oh, good King Josiah, and a lot of good things are happening. Well, it was just outward, and God said, no, it's nothing. I'm going to bring the judgment. And there's another principle. You can have outward godliness, but you deny the power thereof. Inwardly, you're not changed to have piety to work. You just look good. And here's the thing, that what they latched hold of as being important, wealth, who they are, flesh and blood. He said, even you are discounted as nothing in the face of God's judgment. And it all goes back to you sin. Against whom? God. We don't want to do this sin of God, but even though I am sinning against the man that going to take his wife. But it's sinning against God ultimately, and that's what David would do. He sinned against, right, but he also sinned against God. You read the Psalms, and you see that that's exactly against thee only have I sinned. Even though he sinned against a lot of folks. But he sinned against God. That's the ultimate thing. And God indeed brings a judgment upon those that do that. So again, it's simple principles, but it just keeps stressing, and we see even God's people fall into that problem as well. What is the only way to escape from God's fierce anger for the people of Judah? Yeah, they turn around. Let's just notice some things that we go into chapter 2. This terrible day, all them that dwell in the land, gather yourselves together, yea, gather together, O nation that hath no shame. They have no shame. God's people, no shame, before the decrees bring forth, before the day pass as the shaft, before the fierce anger of Jehovah. See, it's almost like just nothing. God's judgment is here and his wrath is there, and you cannot withstand it. There's nobody important enough to dissuade God from doing what he's doing. He says, the fierce anger of Jehovah come upon you, before the day of Jehovah's anger come upon you. So he says, seek ye Jehovah, all ye meek of the earth, that have kept his ordinances. Seek righteousness. Seek meekness. That it may be ye will be hid in the day of Jehovah's anger. All right, there's the idea of being hid in God. Zephaniah, the name. And the idea of being hid is the concept of his name. And we see here it did say you will be. It said that you will be hid. It may be that you will be hid. The only way we could ever escape the judgment of God and be hid from that wrath is not how much money we have, not how important we think we are, how many allies we have in the world around us. It's just the fact that we're going to seek Jehovah and be godly. And that's what they needed to do. That's the only way you could ever hide from the wrath of God. And there's a great principle for us today. Notice what he says you're seeking. We need to be seeking Jehovah, not avoiding him. That's our statement on our sign right now, and I'm keeping it up there for a while, because that's our purpose of life. We're to seek Jehovah, not ignore him. And what happens in our world is that we ignore God and don't even think he exists in a lot of quarters. But it says, seek ye Jehovah, all ye meek of the earth. It says that it kept his ordinances. Seek righteousness. So if I seek Jehovah, I'm going to have to seek righteousness. Why? Why? Because God is righteous. His gospel is where we find today the righteousness of God. And seek meekness. So here's the meekness. He said, ye meek of the earth. Well, how am I going to be meek? I got to seek it. I got to want to. I've got to desire to do that. And want to serve God. That's a godly, let's talk about this godly attitude. It's seen in action. I just got a good attitude. No, it's what you do. What are you seeking? I want to seek what's right. I want to bring myself in control of God. That's the idea of seeking meekness. And it may be you will be hid in the day of Jehovah's anger. Of course, God's judgment, as Zephaniah is saying, is coming. It's not going to be delayed. But here's the only way you could have. And the people, they ignored that. And notice he's speaking the days of Josiah. And we always think that's very positive. So Zephaniah is a great book to kind of put over there when we're reading the Kings and Chronicles. Oh, Josiah, 8 years old, 16 years old, 20-year-old, 26-year-old, finding the law, respecting it. What a great young man he was. He is in history as being something so that's where young people ought to grow up. But reality is that you can have a form of reform and it not be, God doesn't think a thing about it. God doesn't speak anything in Zephaniah about the reforms. That's just what amazes me. He didn't give me a little crumb out here because he's bringing judgment on them because they're not doing what verse 3 says. So we need to seek Jehovah while he can be found, because there's days when he will not be found. Judgment is coming. And that's what's going to be happening. So anything about escape? And again, the only way we can ever escape is through Jesus Christ today. And then to be seeking righteousness, seeking meekness in our lives. Am I really submitting to you, God, and your law? Or am I just doing what I want to do? Yes, sir. That's right. That's a good point. All right. Number 12. When God punishes Felicia, who would dwell in her borders? Let's try to, in your mind's eye, and you may have it before you, where is Philistia? Where are the Philistines? How would you locate them on a map? East, west, north, or whatever. Okay, along the coast of the Mediterranean. Notice how he describes them, and here you've got these major Philistine cities that shall be Gaza shall be forsaken, Ashkelon a desolation. They shall drive out Ashdod, a very principal city, at noonday. It will take place. And Ekron shall be rooted up. Woe unto the inhabitants, and here's Richard's point, seacoast, and the nation of the Kerethites, or Kerethites. Who were they? Well, they're the Philistines, and they probably came from Crete. So that island of Crete, there in the western Mediterranean, eastern Mediterranean, that's where we find the Kerethites. That's where so these Philistines probably were on that island. They came in, or they on that west coast, on that coast, went into the on the island of Crete. But that's where the Kerethites, and the word Jehovah against you, O Canaan. There's the area of Canaan. The Philistines occupied that territory. And so he speaks about their principal cities, maybe the origin of where they came from, the things that are known by them, but they're embodiment of the Philistines. And God is bringing a judgment upon them. So we see something interesting, that when he speaks about the judgment, I will destroy thee, verse 5, and there shall be no inhabitant. The sea coast shall be pastures with cottages for shepherds and folds for flocks. So it'd be kind of a wilderness area. Flocks will be there, not city, not fortresses and things, but places where the shepherds could dwell as they look after the flocks in the wilderness. So it's more of a rural type area, even in the days that we speak here. It's going to be devastated because these cities are going to be uninhabited, but they'll be for someone. The coast shall be hid for whom? The remnant of the house of whom? Judah. So here's the remnant of the house. They shall feed their flocks thereupon. In the houses of Ashkelon shall they lie down in the evening. That's where you have peace. Make me lie behind still waters and green pastures, and there's the stillness that sheep can feel safe, but that'll be for God's people. In the evening, for Jehovah thy God will visit them and bring back their captivity. So even though God's going to bring judgment, and the day Zephaniah is saying it's coming, it's hastening its way, it's not going to be much longer, we know down the future, even in Zephaniah's day, that God would do what? He'd bring back his remnant. Who are they? Judah would come back. The northern kingdom would not come back, though there were people that had been dispersed, and they're all going to come back as far as the remnant under Christ, which we see in the Gospels. But here we see that his remnant and God's people would come back. Judah would come back. They would occupy that area. And Zephaniah said that will take place. So Philistines that have been an arch enemy of God's people for a long time, battles back and forth, David the giant, so forth, all of those things will take place. Well, God's going to bring judgment upon them. So my point, I want to make a point here. Why is he now, he's been speaking about God's people and the judgment, the day of wrath, and then he speaks about these particular cities, and then we'll come into chapter 3, he speaks about Judah again. And I think the point he's making, if I'm going to take care of these cities, and you know that will take place, and just to realize that I will be conquering them, I will conquer you. I will come against my own city as well. Because the principle, I'm a holy God, I am a jealous God, and after long suffering is ended, I will bring judgment upon you. And that's what's happening to all these cities. And we'll get to those specific points as we see here. But he's dropping off, I'm going to take care of these nations. If I'm taking care of them in judgment, I'll take care of you. That's the impact of Zephaniah. That ought to wake people up. It told you the only way you could be hid is seek me. And then all of a sudden, I'm going to talk about Gaza. I'm going to talk about Ashdod. Why are you moving there? Because that's the only thing that makes sense. Because he comes back to this rebellious, polluted city in chapter 3, and it's Jerusalem. Any questions on Philistia, where the island of Crete comes in? And Titus he's on the island of Crete, and when Paul writes to him, and that's kind of where the Philistines' origin, I think, was, and most people believe. All right, question number 13. Moab and Ammon will be punished for their what? And will they, do you see pride in them? They'll be punished, let's say, in what they've done, and you're right about going against God's people and himself. Because I've heard the reproach of Moab and the revelings of the children of Ammon, where they have reproached my people, so there's the Judah involved, and magnify themselves against their borders. So here, get this thought of magnifying. Therefore, as I live, said Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab shall be as Sodom, and the children of Ammon as Gomorrah. Idea of being destroyed and being a place possession of nettles and salt pits and a perpetual desolation. That's the idea, desolation, and would continue to be characterizing that area of the Dead Sea, Sodom and Gomorrah, south of that. And this is Moab and Ammon in that direction on our maps. And he says, the residue of people shall make a prey of them, and the remnant of my nation shall inherit them. And they shall have for their pride, see, magnify themselves against God's people, their pride, because they have reproached and magnified themselves. Pride, magnify, I'm better than everyone else, I'm invincible, against the people of Jehovah of hosts. So they'll be punished for their pride. How did they manifest it? They went against God's people, and therefore went against God. And they had a lot of history with that. But they indeed will be destroyed by God, his reproach upon them. How thorough was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah? Pretty thorough. Perpetual desolation will be left for them. And that's how he takes care of them. So I'm looking at the Philistines on the eastern part of the Mediterranean, the western part of Canaan. I'm going east now. I'm in Moab and Ammon, and let's just go right south. That's we're hitting all the parts of the map of the nations that surrounded Judah and Jerusalem. And if I'm taking them down, I'll take you down too, Jerusalem. That's what we're feeling, the movement of this particular prophecy. Anything you want to add to? They went against God's people. You go against them, you go against me, God says. But they magnify themselves as if they were invincible, but they're not. God brings you down, and before destruction, it comes pride. That's what it always does. All right, let's look at question number 14. And this is dealing with the Ethiopians. When God says, "My sword would slay the Ethiopians," in whose hands would God place his sword? Let's notice in verse 12, "Ye Ethiopians also, ye shall be slain by my sword." That's what God says, my sword. And I'm asking, whose hand was the sword of God placed in to do his bidding upon Ethiopia? Who would it be?
New King James says, he capitalized, is capitalized, and. So he's using capital H on both ways, not anything that's God's hand.
And I think it is God's sword, but I'm asking, whose hands would God place his sword to do his bidding? God didn't come down just a sword down. Let's look at and God rewards nations for doing his bidding. And I think we see, let's go to Ezekiel. We're going to go into future time when these events would transpire, and Ezekiel will help us, I think, see some interesting aspects about this. Let's first of all understand, at this particular time, Ethiopia had rulers that were ruling Egypt. We always say Egypt's the one. And Ethiopia, they're just a bunch of, they just run races. they run long distances, that sort of thing. They had the power during this particular time with their kings ruling in the area of Egypt, even though they were very far south of what we think is principal Egypt. But what would happen is that when the Ethiopians go, Egypt goes, because Ethiopia was the power at that time. So notice in Ezekiel, the 29th chapter. I'm not going to read a lot of this, but let's just pick it up in verse 7. This is the context of Egypt to be subdued by Babylon. I'm suggesting Babylon got the sword of God and took down Ethiopia. Ezekiel lets us in on this. It came to pass in the 7th and 20th year, the first month, the word of Jehovah came to me, saying, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, caused his army to serve a great service against Tyre. God used Nebuchadnezzar to take down Tyre. He did me a good service. This is God speaking. He says, every head was made bald, every shoulder was worn, yet had he no wages, nor his army from Tyre, for the service that he has served against it. Therefore thus saith Jehovah, behold, I will give the land of Egypt unto whom? Ethiopia and Egypt. Who am I giving it to? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He shall carry off her multitude, take her spoil, take her prey. There'll be wages for his army. I'm paying them back with Tyre, what they did for Tyre, the spoil that's coming from Egypt and Ethiopia. Zephaniah is saying that God has said, my sword. But whose hand does he put his sword? The rod of God was in the hand of whom? We talk about bringing the northern kingdom down. Assyria. So God uses nations to conquer nations, but it's his sword. As Norris has said, that's why it's capitalized. in our Bibles. It's God's sword, but he uses nations to bring them down. And that's, again, an important principle. So we come down to chapter 30. We can look at that. And the word Jehovah came to me saying, prophesy. And verse 4, a sword shall come upon Egypt, and anguish shall be in Ethiopia, when the slain shall fall in Egypt, and they shall take away her multitude. Her foundations shall be broken down. Ethiopia put, so forth. Ezekiel's living in a future time than we see in Zephaniah in the days of Josiah and after Jeremiah. But we see unfolding, and that makes it pretty clear. Whose hand was God's sword? Nebuchadnezzar. And what's interesting, he said, this is my reward to your army for doing what you did in Tyre. God rules in the nations of men, and he rewards nations by the spoil as men fight and war against each other. Does that mean that all of a sudden Nebuchadnezzar became a believer in God? No, he'd have to realize what that's like. But they think it's themselves. They've done some great service. So it's just an interesting phrase here, my sword, but God works through means and for his providence. When we think about miraculous works, one thing, but providential working of God is another area where he brings nations against nations. They rise and fall. He causes them to rise and fall. And it's a great thing. If any nation, they may not be believers in Christ, but I would think any rulers of nations that believed in God, they would want to be righteous and do righteous things, what we see in God's word about God, just from the standpoint of history. But that takes belief. That takes seeking Jehovah. That takes seeking righteousness. That means being meek and submitting unto the authority of God. And that's what proud rulers don't do, and proud leaders don't do that sometimes. Anything like to add to that point about my sword? Yes, it's God's sword, but in whose hand was it? In this case, Nebuchadnezzar. All right, question number 15. What divine principle does God's judgment upon Nineveh illustrate? So we come to the end of chapter 2, and he speaks about, thus is the joyous city that dwelt carelessly, that said in her heart, I am there, there's none beside me. How she's become a desolation, a place for beasts and to lie down. And everyone that passeth by her shall hiss and wag his head. So here's Nineveh that's going to be, because we pick up in verse 13, I will stretch out my hand against the north and destroy Assyria and will make Nineveh a desolation. I've taken going west, I've gone southeast, Ammon, I've gone to Ethiopia, and I'm going to Assyria. So I've hit all the directions on the map. Prophets do that. God sends his word out. I've covered all the areas around you, Jerusalem. And you ought to pay attention, because I want to bring you down too. My own people. And he has a special thing for them in chapter 3. So we see Nineveh is spoken here. That indeed will bring them down. So what divine principles does God's judgment upon Nineveh illustrate? What did you put down for that? Some sins out there said, I'm bringing them down. Yeah, that's true. Rich? That's right. Do you see a little pride there of, I am my own God. I am God. I'm in the place of God. I am, and there's none besides me. How is she become a desolation? And here's not, I'm not saying that there's no God. They had their idolatrous gods, but I'm greater than anybody else. There's the pride that's there. We're invincible. And there's nobody that can do that. But there'll be the Medes and the Babylonians and They rise up. They weren't anything at one time. Assyria was the main power. Nineveh is the great city, but it's going down. It'll be destroyed. It'll be desolation, a place for beasts to lie down. There's the idea of desolation, just a place for animals to graze and that sort of thing, the imagery. And he says, and every one that passeth by her shall hiss and wag his head. What is that? What is that a characteristic of when we see that a lot in the Bible? We see it. Do we see it at the cross of Christ? Hissing and wagging their head. What is that?
Hissing, wagging head, sign of shame. That people in the Old Testament do something that I guess we don't really do quite the same now as hiss. It's the mark of derision.
Derision, I think. And the person wagging the head is ashamed of the one that's being crucified, or one that's being polluted, and the city that's being destroyed. He said, "You're just so detestable. And you're just ashamed, and you don't deserve to live." And they did that to Jesus. And you think about all this justice that you may feel like people do. Think about Jesus, what all he took, and he created the universe. He's doing this to bring them to a holy God, a principle that we're seeing in the Old Testament, so they could be saved, would demand his death and the shedding of his blood. And he took that and opened not his mouth in resistance, but let them know he did confess who he was, the Son of God. But he took all of the wagging of the head and the hissing, and you saved others, why can't you save yourself? Come down from that cross, we'll believe you. And you know what? When that happens, that's the thing that gets you riled up. And if you get off that cross, you go down there and show them. There's that where we are. That's small things to God and Jesus. They look beyond. God can see things from eternity. We sometimes don't. We need to be thinking like God. And maybe we can overcome a lot of things the way we should when difficult times happen. Does someone have their hand? David? Okay. All right. Chapter 3 and verse 1. Woe to her that is rebellious. So Jerusalem is described as what? And we have to talk about here filling in the blanks. She is a rebellious, polluted, and oppressing city. Rebellious, polluted, and oppressing city. Now, when you see about rebellious and polluted, do you see cause and effect? Rebelling against whom? God. And therefore polluted. I can be my own God. I can have any God I want to. I'm rebelling against God. The next result will be, you will be a polluted city. And you will say, well, that polluted means that's full of sin. That's exactly what I'm talking about. When you go that route and you leave God as the principal one, the only one deserving of worship, you will have sin, and what's the next step? You will oppress people that you have power over. You'll be an oppressing city. It's this not, well, I just got some free words to put out there. No, there's cause and effect, and you get to the point, how could anybody ever oppress the poor? Well, they became more powerful than God. I have to follow his will. I get entrenched in my sin, going after my lust, and I think I want what you have. And you don't have any way of getting it from me, because he'll talk about princes and judges. They're on the side of me, money. And that's how he's describing Jerusalem. But Josiah, he reformed them. Here's the heart. And what happened, they quickly would be turning into this type of a city because their heart wasn't right. They weren't seeking Jehovah. They weren't seeking meekness. They weren't seeking righteousness. That's what we've been looking at. And so, how could a city ever get this way? How do the major cities in our country get the way they've been the last 18 months? If you just don't, you don't have any morals, just look at it from that stuff, just forget God and Christ and being a Christian. If you have no moral compass because maybe you weren't taught that or you have that, you become the one that I can go into Walgreens and I will get what I want and nobody's going to stop me because we got the government's messed up. We're not going to stop you. That was $998 and it's $1,000 we'll get after you. You just got under the wire. And they just go and they don't feel any pressure. But they're the so-called poor. But what happens is that the powerful, they become oppressors. Have you felt that among powerful governors, not necessarily in our state, but governors that just shut it down? They'll tell you who's going to be the winner. They're going to tell you who's going to be the loser. And you're going to have to deal with that. And you're not going to school unless you do this, and you're not going to be able to get that job unless you do that. They're shutting down like that in Puerto Rico right now. And the brethren, now the schools, the law is, or at this present time, that if you're 12 or over, you have to be vaccinated. Mandatory. If you're, going to school. They're putting that on. And regardless of what you think about the science, about everything, it's all over the board anyway. That's being mandatory because they can. They have the power to do that. And here are Christians that indeed are wanting to rebel. And our time's about up, but think about this principle. Here's what some of the arguments are. Well, I can rebel against, I don't have to be vaccinated, even though it's now become the law where you are. What dogma of God? Because the only way you can get out of that is that you have a dogma that you live by, a religious dogma that will give you an exception, that you don't have to be vaccinated. What would that dogma be for the Christian? And some create with Revelation 13. Revelation 13. There's the oppressing government, and you have to have the mark of the beast in order to be employed. And there may be similarities there, but being vaccinated to save your life is what is being that you're going to stand up against. It's kind of hard to make that from a clear conscience that, yeah, it's a teaching of our church that you're doing a Revelation 13. Revelation 13 was idolatry. The guilds were full of idolatry. But here's something that we want you to be vaccinated. And the Christian, I don't see Revelation 13, I see Romans 13, where a responsibility of a government. But here's the thing, they say, well, it's a Romans 14 thing. You need to honor your conscience. Let's say one brother does it, one doesn't, and we're in Puerto Rico, we can have fellowship with one another on Romans 14. So, but to rebel against the government, that's the case. At one time, the idea of aborted babies were being used for the vaccines, and that became to be something that's not true. There may be an area there. We do honor life and that sort of thing, but that has never been brought out. But I can see how oppressed people feel when government gets in control, and we're seeing when you become that powerful and you leave God out of it, you'll do what you want to do in that sin, and you'll become an oppressor. And I think we've seen that. I can't believe it. People with power, how oppressive they want to be in things. And I think that's just the nature of mankind. They get that. And that's why elderships are supposed to be what they're supposed to be, not lording it over the flock, but leading them in the ways of God and so forth. God sees that in our nature. But how quick a nation can go from liberty to being oppressed. And I think we've seen a little touch of how quick that can be. Any thoughts on that before we close? Please notice at verse 3, her princes in the midst of her are roaring lions, her judges are evening wolves, and they don't leave anything to the morrow. They will completely destroy you and wipe you out. The princes, here's the leaders, and the judges that rule against you. You don't have a chance, poor man. You don't have a chance. What does he say about the prophet? Her prophets are light and treacherous. Now, when a prophet is light, what is he? You're a light case. We think that sometimes. And it's the only time he says anything about the prophets in Zephaniah. So we need to get a hold of that, and I'll just leave that with you. We'll find out what that means in application. The prophets are light and treacherous, and we'll put those two together. We'll stop there tonight. Thank you very much for being here and your participation.